turning male frogs female, whereby frogs, quote, lack male reproductive behavior, have reduced male features, mate with other males despite being genetically male. Or, according to Fox News, everyone's favorite, frogs used in the water-only tanks remained male, where frogs exposed to atrazine were, I quote, completely feminized. Their genes said they should be male, but they had female anatomy. This article goes on to state that in both frogs and humans, sex is purely genetic. Or, perhaps most telling is the opening paragraph for an article in Mother Jones, which is an online magazine. I'm quoting Mother Jones here. Genetically, Daryl, which was one of Hayes' frogs, is male. After being raised in water contaminated with herbicide atrazine at the levels of 2.5 parts per billion, slightly less than what's allowed in drinking water, he developed a female body, inside and out. He's the mother of his children, having successfully mated with other males and spawned clutches of eggs. Recently, he was moved to atrazine-free tank and turned lanky, losing the plump, pincushion look of a female frog. But Daryl's insides were still female. Later, Mother Jones reports that male frogs exposed to atrazine early in life have feminized brains and tend to assume the bottom position when copulating, even when placed in a tank with females. They had, I quote, an identity that says female. In the media's uptake of Hayes' atrazine studies, we see a kind of slipperiness surrounding what atrazine actually does to male frogs' bodies. Language never quite explains what changes in the frogs due to atrazine exposure. Pronoun usage unintentionally oscillates, homosexual couplings can give birth, male frogs can become mothers, genotypes and phenotypes contradict. Coexisting with this linguistic ambiguity is a discursive dependence on the taken-for-granted assumptions about what male traits and female traits are. These traits exist prior to the body that is being sexed. They are seen as objective standards by which any body can be measured. These articles make it clear that there are reproductive behaviors, features, anatomy, and genes that can be reliably associated with males, which are distinct from those that can be reliably associated with females. Significantly, there is little to no reference of anything that exceeds or is in excess of male and female. There is never a proposal for a corporeal site of stable mixing. No sex that is not male or female. Yet clearly there's a digression from the normal sexual difference happening here. Scientific findings and cultural understandings of these studies depend on the sustained contradiction, a reaffirmation of the gender binary in the midst of its very undoing. I want to again invoke Butler to explain what regulatory work this discourse around deviancy is doing. According to Butler, the abject are those unlivable and unthinkable zones of social life, which are nevertheless densely populated by those who do not enjoy the status of the subject, but who's living under the sign, but the bodies of Hayes frogs never quite comply with the norms by which their materialization is impelled. One might argue that they constitute the abject, the normally sexed bodies. Evidence of this exists in the terms the media uses to discuss atrazine-exposed frogs. They are disturbing, malformed, abnormal, retarded. These materialization of sexual difference is unstable. Abjection threatens to expose the self-grounding presumptions of the sex subject by its very material difference. Specifically, the bodies of Hayes frogs give fleshy testimony to the possibility of digression from the rigid gender binary. Yet the deviancy of the bodies of Hayes frogs compels the reinscription of the limits of subjectivity through the assertion that normal sexual difference is not what is exemplified by these frogs. So, although there's a certain allowance for gender fluidity in saying that male frogs can turn female or assume a female identity, the materialization of sexual difference in Hayes frogs is still governed by the reiterative and highly regulatory practices. With Butler's theories of the abject in mind, I want to ask, what would it mean to reconduct these studies under different discursive and institutional conditions? How would the scientific methods and results differ if we disallowed the use of a rigid gender binary in scientific knowledge-making practices? How would the materialization of sexual difference and reproductive abnormalities change? Yet it would be a mistake to attribute atrazine's effects on haze frogs to some kind of discursive fiction. As contemporary work in feminist materialism demonstrates, language is not reductively constitutive of all phenomena. Offering a critique of post-structuralism and postmodern feminists, Alemo tells us that the predominant paradigms in feminist theory tend to focus exclusively on how various bodies have been discursively produced, consistently leaving the material under-theorized. She tries to counter this trend to diminish the significance of materiality by rethinking materiality within the context of the interchanges and interconnectedness of human corporeality in the more-than-human environment. Proposing a theory of transcorporeality, Alemo theorizes that the human is always intermeshed in the more-than-human world, caught in a, to use her term, contact zone of human corporeality in the complex world of fleshy beings with their own needs, claims, and actions. This emphasis on material interconnectedness imagines a world as an assemblage of human bodies, critters, forces, ecological systems, and chemical toxins that are continually interacting, to use Karen Barad's term, which I'll be returning to later, in ways that are too complex to be predicted in advance. Well, Alemo's project in transcorporeal feminisms in the ethical space of nature is to situate human corporeality in relation to the more than human. The idea of material bodies as enmeshed in assemblages of interactivity is relevant to understanding the scientific and cultural phenomena surrounding haze frogs, in the sense that thinking of matter as transformable, dynamic, and relational exposes the very rigidity of sexual oppositions within culture. The gendered materiality of haze frogs emerges within the unstable contact zone of nature, culture, human, non-human, subject-object, science-politics, biological, textual, corporeal, technological. Correspondingly, because the material is always interacting with the social, the economic, cultural, historical, psychological, and symbolic forces, the scientifically observed materiality of sexual difference is dynamic and contextual, fluctuating in response to changes in these material semiotic assemblages. Seeing the scientific phenomena of observed sexual difference in Hayes' laboratory as material semiotic requires a radical re-theorizing of non-human agency. Significantly, the material is not passive, inert, static, but instead material semiotic, intercorporeal, performative, and agential. Human and animal bodies are not blank slates awaiting the inscription of culture. They can talk back, resist, or otherwise affect their cultural construction. Bodies have their own forces that are often beyond our understanding. They baffle, annoy, disappoint, or fall ill. Bodies resist the reiteration of regulatory norms, push back against discursive power, refuse to conform, make themselves undesirable. Pickering, theorizing the significance of this reconceptualization of material agency in terms of science studies, says that scientists are, and I'm quoting him here, human agents in the field of material agency in which they struggle to capture in machines. Because the human and material agency are reciprocally and emergently intertwined in scientific practice, the bodies of Hayes frogs, among other non-human matter in the laboratory, are not passive objects for scientific study, but are participants, agents, and even authors of scientific knowledge. The bodies of Hayes frogs are not reductively defined or constructed by discursive or extracorporeal forces. They contain a kind of affective agency. They can affect and be affected. Importantly, the agency of frog bodies and other non-human matter does not exist in isolation, but emerges within a web of material and discursive forces. Karen Barad, in her stunning book, Meeting the Universe Halfway, offers some interesting insight into the material semiotic conceptualizations of agency with her notion of agential realism. Agency is not aligned with human intentionality or subjectivity, and I'm quoting her here, nor does it merely entail the resignification of anti-humanism. Agency is a matter of interacting. It is an enactment, not something that someone is or has. Agency is not an attribute whatsoever. It is a doing, a being, in its interactivity. Barad's agential realism severs agency from its traditional humanist underpinnings, transporting agency into the post-humanist realm. Agency is not possessed by one group and thereby denied